Peter Rosset is the fifth speaker, and he's a researcher and professor at El Colegio. I can't pronounce this very well. El Colegio. Yes. Ecosur in Chiapas, Mexico. He's also a researcher at the Center for the Study of Rural Change in Mexico and is co-coordinator of the Land Research Action Network. He's also a member of Via Campesina's technical committee.
Good morning. I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about one aspect in our paper, which is the internal process inside Via Campesina. Some people have noted that Via Campesina as a transnational social movement is somewhat surprising, the fact that it exists, considering that it brings together farmers who are producing for the market, farmers who are producing for subsistence, landed, landless, farmers, farm workers, indigenous, non-indigenous, bigger, smaller, north, south, east, west, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, animist, Hindu, atheist, Marxist, Leninist, and somehow this movement has been able to not only hold together, but to move forward. And so some of the questions that I want to ask is, what holds it together? What allows it to move forward? How are the interpretive frames constructed collectively, interpretive frames both for internal mobilization and also for building consensus and larger society? How do the visions, the collective visions, evolve? For example, how does Via Campesina, or did Via Campesina evolve from a focus on land and the struggle in the agrarian reform campaign to a focus on territory and the defense of land and territory? How is new knowledge produced? And here I'd like to say that I think that in today's world, there is a massive center of production of new knowledge and theoretical contributions that is now coming from social movements, even to, in my opinion, to a larger extent than from the academy. I see movements like the Zapatistas in Mexico and the MST in Brazil as making enormous contributions and theoretical contributions to many of these debates. And how, for example, are processes in real territories constructed, like agroecology processes, and agroecology is a particularly good case to look at this in Via Campesina. So we argue that there's both an underlying implicit process that occasionally in Via Campesina is also an explicit methodology. People who speak Spanish will say this is nothing new. In Spanish it's called diálogo de saberes. In English it would be called a dialogue amongst different ways of knowing, and it's a way to move forward faced with such tremendous internal diversity as that in Via Campesina. Some of the principles for a diálogo de saberes are that everybody has to accept that all ways of knowing are valid. All cosmovisions are just another cosmovision. One is not superior to the other. That it's possible to despite our differences, to gradually and iteratively expand our areas of consensus that serve for collective action. And I think we've noted how the food sovereignty concept has changed, the definition over time. And this is a product of that internal and external process, because the dialogic process is both inside Via Campesina, with Via Campesina and other actors, and is also a dialogue between an internal process and an evolving external world. One of the elements is how has Via Campesina lasted for 20 years without fragmenting like many prior movements have, and I think part of the Diálogo de Saberes is tabling things that generate too much conflict to be taken up at a later date, sometimes 2 or 3 years later. Paul talked about how frustrating it may be for others to get an answer from Via Campesina, but that's also one of the reasons why Via Campesina has been able to survive and grow. This kind of Diálogo de Saberes is based on a lot of exchange of experience, exchange of cosmovision, and actual cross visits. In the agroecology process, we see a lot of production of new knowledge with contributions from different ways of knowing. For example, in Latin America, we can say in a very stylistic way that we have three different typical kinds of visions of the rural world within Via Campesina. We have the indigenous vision or cosmovision, proletarian vision, and we have a farmer, strictly farmer kind of a vision, all of which to the agroecology process in Via Campesina have made critical contributions. For the farmer organizations, farmer identity organizations, knowledge is transmitted experientially, and they've contributed the incredibly important farmer-to-farmer kind of methodology. The indigenous organizations where knowledge is transmitted and codified through culture and inherited knowledge have made a tremendous contribution to understanding territory, how to think in terms of territory, the importance of living with Mother Earth. The proletarian organizations where knowledge is typically transmitted in a scholarized Cartesian manner have made a tremendous contribution in terms of the importance of what is called in Via Campesina organicity, or the internal organization, and have brought a very powerful, radical political analysis. All of this comes together, both in the construction of territorial processes like farmer to farmer, like community to community, like peasant organization to peasant organization, and also in the more explicit knowledge transmission spaces, such as the more than 40 peasant agroecology schools that Via Campesina now has around the world that Paul alluded to, some of which are actually peasant universities, which give university degrees to sons and daughters of peasants, degrees that include agroecology and political ideological training. And I'll kind of start to close with two anecdotes. I just came from the 4th Latin American Congress of Agroecology, which took place in Lima, Peru. There were 1,000 people there. About 950 of them were academics, professors, PhDs. And we had a delegation from CLAC Via Campesina, and the 3 talks that literally brought down the house, that stood out of all of these 1,000 papers, 2 of them were given by peasants young peasants who had graduated from our first agroecology university in Venezuela, Yale Paulo Freire, the Latin American Agroecology Institute, and the other talk that brought down the house was given by a young woman MST militant who's part of the political pedagogical coordination of our peasant agroecology university in the Amazon region of Brazil. People were absolutely stunned by how articulate, knowledgeable, and insightful these young peasants were who had gone through this internal political and technical formation process in Via Campesina, and it was clear to all of those who were present the production of knowledge coming from social movements and the high level of articulateness and critical thinking that's being constructed in this collective process. And in these schools, the pedagogical philosophy is this diálogo de saberes, or dialogue amongst different forms of knowledge. Thank you.